Hi everyone. There's a lot going on in the news at the moment. Um, it's really been a busy news week. There's the latest flare up between India and Pakistan. I haven't made a specific video on that. I'm going to be watching the situation. Hopefully, it doesn't escalate too much more. There's always big concern there because they're both nuclear powers. There's a papal conclave. I'll be making a video about that. The latest is more black smoke from the Vatican, so the cardinals still haven't chosen. I suspect it'll be sometime this evening if previous conclaves of recent decades are anything to go by. Um, and the other thing is VE Day, the 80th anniversary of VE Day. Sometimes said marking the end of the Second World War. I do think it's important to be technical about that, marking the end of the European War, the war against German fascism, because the war did drag on for 3 more months and thousands, tens of thousands more died. Um, there was still British soldiers as prisoners of war whilst VE Day was being celebrated. And I think one reason the Labour government of Clement Attlee had a landslide in 1945, a lot of those votes, I think, came from overseas servicemen who were a bit resentful that they were sort of forgotten. That's the impression I get anyway from various documentaries I've seen and so on. Nevertheless, it is a very significant moment. It was the downfall of one of the most ghastly regimes in history, um, and a very, very important day. Apparently, I didn't know this before. There was some argument. The historian James Holland was talking about this in his BBC report. There was some argument between Stalin and Churchill over the exact moment it should be marked. The Soviets argued it should be the 9th of May, when they fully liberated Berlin and when they forced the Germans to surrender, whereas the Allies had marked 8th of May because the momentum was fully there, and that's when the Germans had surrendered to the British and American delegations, as I understand it. Um, so this subject's very much been on my mind. I've been watching a few World War II based films. Last night I watched The Desert Rats. It's a little bit dated. Richard Burton, James Mason, 1953. I actually watched another film with James Mason in which he played the same role, that of Erwin Rommel, earlier in the week. Um, there is also a very unusual film called A Matter of Life and Death with David Niven. I watched last night. I've seen it before. Kim Hunter, who was later known for her role in the Planets of the Apes series. Anyway, I'm just right, hello. Anyway, very very unusual movie even for the time. It was made by Paul and Pressburger. I'm just going to mention this briefly in passing. Very unusual movie. If you don't know, it's basically about a young airman whose Lancaster bomber has been hit. He's going down, or wouldn't be a Lancaster bomber actually, but anyway, he's going down. He's sort of thinking any efforts are futile, and he's talking to a radio operator played by Kim Hunter. Um, and he basically he thinks he's going to die, so he wants his last moment to be talking to this nice girl that he's never met on the radio. Um, but he cheats death, um, or he's in this sort of limbo. And the basic premise is he's put on trial in heaven for cheating death. There's been a mix up in heaven, and he's literally put on trial. He has to explain why they should be together. It's a very unusual movie. I don't think it's comparable to anything else. The prosecution lawyer happens to be the first soldier killed in the American Revolution, so naturally he hates Englishmen. And there's this whole scene in the prosecution where he cites all those nations that England's been at war with and why. And they do specifically say England. It was a thing of old films, not Britain, England. It's quite specific. Um, and then the defense argues about why um, why he should live and why actually I won't say too much. It's an unusual film. Let's just put it that way. A Royal Night Out, which is a fictional account of Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, is a film that absolutely fits today. I've seen it a few times. It's made a few years ago. Um, Big actor plays King George VI, whose name eludes me now. Um, can't recall off the top of my head. Anyway, that's been very much in my mind, but I want to talk about the symbolism of the day. I think this and later in the year, VJ Day will be the last big World War II commemorations. That's pretty significant. I mean, in my lifetime, every few years, every 5 years or so, there's either a big commemoration for D-Day or VE Day or the liberation of Auschwitz or another World War II commemoration. And this is it. 2025 will mark the last big ones. I'm not saying it will be forgotten after this. I don't actually agree that World War II will ever be forgotten. It's just too big an event to be forgotten. Um, I'm not even sure that's true that young people aren't interested. I think if you look up and down the country, actually young people are taking part in activities. So I don't really agree that they're not interested at all. Obviously, as it goes further back in time, as veterans get older, it will become more distant. That's just inevitable. Um, and what we'll have is the children of veterans who themselves are now in their 90s. So children who were alive during the Blitz are now in their 90s, and it will be their memories. But in terms of those who actually served, um, their average age now is between 98 and 101. If you were 18 in 1945, you'd be, um, my math serves me right, 100 now. So we are going to see a split from that generation when the last veteran dies. I remember when Harry Patch died, the last Tommy of World War One. He died in 2009, some 91 years after the conflict. Now, working on that maths, and it doesn't obviously quite work like this, but working on that time scale, the last World War Two military veteran will die in about 10 or 11 years from now, which means that will be a cut from that generation. So I'm very interested in some of the things going on. I did watch the flyover on Monday. The royal family, of course, appeared on the balcony. It was very impressive. I think it's one thing this country does well. We do ceremony very well in Britain. Um, and I'm pleased that there was a Ukrainian unit. I'm going to be talking about that in a minute. There was a Ukrainian unit that took part and got a big applause, including a salute from the king. Um, Today, I'm going to go to Kill Square in Sunderland. There's supposed to be some things going on there. Apparently, they've got some World War II vehicles, dancing, singing. Um, I hope I haven't missed it. And there's a special service in our local, in the Minster Church in Sunderland. So I'm going to go to that. Like you say, busy news day. There may be the announcement from the papal conclave at the same time. So editors are going to have a real headache over what they cover tomorrow. I would probably, I mean, I'd cover both if I was an editor. I'd probably lead on the VE Day stuff, but I'd certainly have a sizable subsection on the new Pope. Um, and India and Pakistan, there's these three big stories going on at once. Um, and that's not to say there isn't other things going on in the world. Israel's vowing to take over the whole of Gaza, which is an abomination, and I think worthy of its own video at some point if we get round to it. I just think I mean, every action Israel takes, I lose more and more sympathy. I just think it's appalling what they're doing. The day Pope Francis wanted his Pope Mobile converted into an ambulance, and it won't be able to enter Gaza, but it is symbolic. Um, I want to talk about Ukraine because the significance of VE Day, we say victory in Europe. War is going on in Europe today. Europe's not at peace. We now have war in Europe. And true, it's Eastern Europe, it's a long way from London or Berlin or Paris, but it's not so far as to be detached. And I take it very personally because I've got very connected to the Ukrainian community here in 2025. For me, it's one of the highlights of 2025. It's sort of, on one hand, it's a good thing that I've met these people, these inspiring people. On the other hand, it's sad that it's in these circumstances. But I think the significance is even more profound because of this. We have war in Europe in 2025. Now, I think what the Trump administration is proposing is appalling. A while back they threatened to wipe their hands of it if Russia and Ukraine wouldn't agree to a ceasefire. What I find so utterly, utterly disgusting, and I use that word, is the way the Americans, by which I mean Trump, Vance, and Rubio gaslight the Ukrainians, sort of imply they don't want peace if they don't sign up to America's pressure. I'd make this analogy again. If a big portion of the United States was invaded and occupied, thousands of Americans died, American women raped, American children kidnapped, there's not a damn chance in hell an American leadership would be saying to a third party, okay, we'll go along with your peace proposals, even though you're blaming us. It's just for Trump to claim that he's neutral. He may think he is at this point because there's been a few fractions emerging between him and Putin, but it should never be forgotten that Donald Trump has repeated Russian propaganda. And it took his own pastor going to Sumi and that meeting at the Vatican for Trump to finally get half a degree of conscience and say, oh, Russia's wrong in what it's doing. And he hasn't even barely said that. The most he could come up with is bad timing, and it's a mistake. A mistake is if you're paying a counter and you accidentally give the wrong amount of money, that's a mistake. Massacring civilians on Easter in a missile strike is not a mistake, it's an atrocity. I saw footage of a man in South Africa, a Ukrainian, and there was this ghastly picture of Putin beside Nelson Mandela, coming out of big games because unfortunately, in a large part of the developing world and many parts of Africa and Asia, there isn't the same attitude to Putin as we have in Europe. And that's one of the greatest tragedies of our age, that Russian disinformation has seeped into such an extent that they actually see Putin as someone to admire. Well, he went over and spray painted on this war criminal, and some locals tried to stop him. Well, I'm thinking, firstly, they should understand how black people are treated in Russia because it's one of the most racist countries in the world. Secondly, he was right to lose his temper. How dare they tell him what he's doing is wrong, yet they're okay with that dictator raining bombs on the man's hometown? I'm not sure specifically which town he was from, but Ukrainians have absolutely every right to feel angry when they see Putin celebrated. Um, Unfortunately, in this country, with a few Putin apologists, I absolutely do not trust reform on this. That may be for a specific video, but I don't trust reform when it comes to Russia. Um, Labour has kept up the sort of consistency that the last government did. So that's one good thing about Labour. They've made many mistakes, but one thing I do give Labour and Starmer credit for is support for Ukraine. It's a good thing, and I must admit I thought it was good to see when that appalling way that Zelensky was treated in the Oval Office, and he then came to London and it was a much better reception. I'm pleased to see that. Um, Volodymyr Zelensky isn't perfect, but this is a man who has tirelessly. I mean, the war's physically aged him. He's still a young man. He's only in his 40s, but he has done his level best to defend his country. And I'm sickened by these cards, these morally bankrupt cards who put little snipes at Zelensky like he just wants American money. I mean, they act as if he's going out in luxury yachts and going on skiing holidays and stuff. He is doing this to try and defend his country, as any leader would do in his shoes. As far as I'm concerned, Zelensky's a hero. He's one of the most inspiring leaders of modern times, and that is no exaggeration. Um, when I see the Ukrainians maligned, I just feel disgusted. Now, Trump's peace plan, so called, let me put it this way. I'm realistic. I know at some point there may have to be some compromise. There may be some things the Ukrainians may not get absolutely everything they want. I recognize that may be the case. I think what Trump proposes is just too much. Giving up Crimea, giving up all the occupied regions, not joining NATO. Um, I just think they're being asked too much. The thing about NATO, Ukrainians have paid in blood for the right to be in NATO, and those who want to regurgitate Russian propaganda, Russia's surrounded by NATO. Russia's actions have forced countries to join NATO for protection. Indeed, the question could be reversed. Countries in Eastern Europe feel surrounded by Russia. I am so sick of pro-Moscow propagandists. And they aren't just, I mean, Russian nationals should expect it, but it isn't just those in the Russosphere and those in the global south. I think perhaps most unforgivable is people living in the UK or the United States or France or Italy who defend Russia. They're beneath contempt as far as I'm concerned, because they may think this is about Ukraine, but Putin will not stop there. You know, he considers the Baltic states part of the old Tsarist empire, so why would he stop? And even if he did, giving Putin what he wants would be rewarding his aggression. That's another point. It would be enabling him. Now, there is an argument that Putin actually doesn't get everything he wants, because he wants the whole of Ukraine. So forcing him into a ceasefire now would be, you know, he wouldn't get everything he wants, but and you know, his military's being hammered. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. We'll probably never know the exact figure of Russian soldiers have died. Now, at some point, their widows, their mothers are going to ask questions. In fact, they probably already are. It'll be interesting to see how this Victory Day parade goes in Moscow. It's always hyped up to be a big thing. No doubt the Chinese will be there. I imagine others will be there as well. I don't think India will be, because they're tied up at the moment. Um, but you know, it's always a big propaganda exercise by Putin. Steve Rosenberg, who's a world-class journalist in my view, he was showing that in Moscow everything is connected with everyone else is bad, Russia is good. I mean, the level of ultra-nationalism in Russian brainwashing is unbelievable. Um, one of the justifications for the war was that Ukrainians were Nazis. They were vilified leading up to this. So if you tell a population over and over and over again the Ukrainians are bad people, they're Nazis, they're going to kill you, you know, you vilify them, you dehumanize them, then of course you're not going to care about Ukrainians being killed. At one point during the invasion, I read a report saying Russian women were actually encouraging their husbands to rape Ukrainian women. That is monstrous. That's the sort of mentality that goes on in Putin's Russia. And some of the bravest people in the world, as far as I'm concerned, are Russian dissidents, those who risk long prison terms or death to speak out. Just as there were some Germans who spoke out against the Third Reich in the 30s. I mean, these people are incredibly brave, but they're in a very, very difficult position, an almost impossible position. I am leaning to the view that maybe the only way Russian aggression ends outside this war in Ukraine is for the fragmentation of Russia itself. It's just too big. That may be the only way that Russia's brought down to size, by which I mean Russian aggression ends. And those who say Russia was humiliated, I would invite them to consider the fact that Russia was a member of the G8. Disgracefully, that's another thing Putin wants, excuse me, Trump wants, to bring Russia back into the fold, to reward it. Now, Russia was in the G8, it was treated as an equal partner for years. They conveniently forget that. I just don't buy this narrative of Russia the victim. Russia was treated as an equal partner for years. And how were we rewarded? Russian aggression, you know, extensive Russian espionage, Salisbury, the Alexander Litvinenko case. That's how Russia repaid the West. Um, Putin's a thug. He's a mass killer. He's one of the worst dictators in history, and that's his legacy. And he can't even point to strengthening the Russian economy, because he didn't. The Russian economy is a joke. So those who want to defend Russia under the guise that Putin strengthened Russia, that's debatable. Russian prestige has been lost. I mean, yes, the Kremlin's going to put on a brave face. Yes, Russia's propagandists will say that it's not defeated, and it's not defeated yet. But consider the fact that Putin cannot show his face at any international event. You know, he couldn't go to the papal funeral, for example. He knows that any event in the West that he goes to, he risks arrest. So he's become an international pariah. Yes, he could probably still visit China and some Asian countries, but make no mistake, Putin's influence has been reduced in the world. There's no question about that. I saw a list yesterday suggesting Russia was the second most powerful country in the world. Absolutely not. That's China. Russia's been greatly reduced. I'm not saying it's totally insignificant. I'm not saying it's still not dangerous. It is, but it's still a nuclear power. It still has a sizable military force, still run by an erratic dictator. But I do think Russian power is reduced, no question about it. I mean, there's only so much of a brave face the Kremlin can put on. Russia's racked by an internal corruption. There's dissent, as we saw from the Prigozhin revolt. The Russian military has lost thousands and thousands and thousands of men. The Russian economy's in a bad way. Putin's a pariah in the West. I don't know how you could argue that Russia has got the same power it had in, say, 2000 or 2005. I don't think it does. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. I just think that it may be that in the end there's going to be some compromise. The Ukrainians may have to be realistic to that. But I think, for example, those living in occupied areas, um, I think if that is the deal, if Russia still maintains control over those areas, there needs to be massive pressure for Russia to respect the human rights of Ukrainian speakers. And that almost sounds like a joke, expecting Russia to do that. But at the very least, if there's a peace deal, there should be huge scrutiny on that, because those people are treated appallingly. There's 20,000 kidnapped Ukrainian children to think about. I mean, what Trump's proposing is just too damn much. It's an insult. And the arrogance, the sheer arrogance of Washington to be saying, because you're not, surrendering everything we want you to, you don't want peace. The Ukrainians want peace. Of course they do. They're the ones who've been suffering more than anyone. Of course they want peace, but they don't want peace at any price. That really isn't rocket science. It's not a mystery that they don't want to just surrender given how much they've sacrificed. And it isn't just for that, it's a fact that it would enable Putin, it would be rewarding Putin. I think Ukraine has more than earned its right to be in NATO. And also joining NATO, of course, the Kremlin will spout off lots of threats and insults, but it may actually make Russia think twice about, for example, if there was a ceasefire, it would make Russia maybe think twice about then attacking a NATO member. Because note so far, Russia hasn't done that. Putin's dangerous and he's tyrannical, but I don't think he's completely stupid. He's not going to, so far in 3 years of this war, he hasn't directly attacked any NATO country because he knows what will happen if he does. That's not from any moral reason. If he got away with it, he would, but it's just for practical reasons. Russia's powerful, but it's minuscule compared to the power of NATO. That's another thing that is disgraceful about Donald Trump, the fact he's publicly denigrating NATO. NATO combined is the most powerful military force in human history. So if you look at NATO and Russia side by side, there's no contest. And people might say, oh, well, but what about Russia and China? I actually don't think China and Russia are going to be in a formal military alliance. They may get a lot of trade deals, but China does not want to be sucked into a European war. It really doesn't. It's even so far held back from giving Russia weapons. I don't actually think as a state policy China sending troops to Ukraine. I honestly think those guys were brainwashed by Russian propaganda. That's what happened. Um, but China may be testing the ground for a possible invasion of Taiwan, which is yet another reason Trump's deal is bad, because it sends out the message to China they can invade Taiwan and get away with it. Anyway, a lot going on. I'm going to go down to the city centre soon to watch the developments. Happy VE Day. Well, we can't say that. It is a celebration. It's the end of the biggest conflict in human history. Um, but yeah, the poignancy for what's happening today in Ukraine is very, very big. Let me know your thoughts.